I have learned to find profit in all my misfortunes. Niccolò Machiavelli. The most dangerous person in your life may be the one who secretly contributes most to your success. In the shadowed corridors of Renaissance Florence, a political exile named Niccolò Machiavelli penned words that would forever alter how humanity understood power, creating a philosophy so controversial that his name became synonymous with cunning manipulation. Yet within his notorious treatise lay a paradox few recognize. Your greatest enemies might be your most valuable assets, if you possess the wisdom to use them correctly. What if everything you've been taught about dealing with opposition is fundamentally flawed? What if rather than avoiding conflicts or neutralizing adversaries, the path to power requires deliberately cultivating certain enemies? This counterintuitive strategy, cultivating and strategically using one's enemies, may be the most misunderstood aspect of Machiavellian thought, and potentially its most brilliant. The illusion of harmony. You wake each morning, scroll through carefully curated social media feeds, and navigate a world where collaboration and positive relationships are unquestioned virtues. Corporate workshops extol the values of teamwork, self-help gurus preach forgiveness and reconciliation, diplomatic relations between nations are judged by their stability rather than strategic advantage. This narrative of harmony permeates modern consciousness so thoroughly that we rarely question its premise. On May 3, 1469, Florence welcomed into the world a child who would grow to challenge this very illusion. Born to a family of modest means but ancient lineage, Niccolò Machiavelli entered a city-state torn by factional struggles, foreign invasions, and the manipulative politics of the Medici family. This Florence, not the tourist destination of romantic paintings, was a crucible of political experimentation where power changed hands through conspiracy, exile, and occasionally, bloodshed. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are, Machiavelli would later write, capturing the essence of political reality that many prefer to ignore. The comfortable illusion that cooperation always trumps competition blinds us to a fundamental truth of human nature. Conflict is inevitable, and those who understand its utility gain advantages others cannot imagine. Consider how this plays in your everyday life. That colleague who consistently challenges your proposals in meetings, do you merely tolerate them, or have you recognized how their opposition forces you to strengthen your arguments? The competitor who entered your market and slashed prices, did this not compel innovations you might never have otherwise discovered? Even that friend whose success secretly fills you with envy, has this not motivated achievements you might otherwise have postponed? The philosophical mirror, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer, goes the famous misattribution to Machiavelli. These words never appear in his writings, though they capture his essence. The actual philosophy runs deeper and darker. In chapter 20 of The Prince, Machiavelli observes that a wise ruler should think of a way to make some citizens in need of the state, so that he can more faithfully hold them. This deliberate creation of dependency, making others need you, reveals Machiavelli's understanding that relationships are instruments of power. The Florentines' insights emerged from historical observation rather than abstract theorizing. During his diplomatic missions across Italy and beyond, he witnessed firsthand how the powerful maintained their positions. In 1502, he observed Cesare Borgia, the ruthless son of Pope Alexander VI, as Borgia consolidated power in the Romagna region through strategic cruelty and carefully calculated mercy. Later, when the Medici family returned to power in Florence in 1512, Machiavelli found himself arrested, tortured, and eventually exiled to his country estate, experiences that crystallized his understanding of power's brutal realities. From this crucible emerged a philosophy that recognized enemies as essential tools, rather than mere obstacles. Consider his advice to rulers: a prince must not worry about the reproach of cruelty when it comes to keeping his subjects united and loyal. This willingness to be feared, rather than loved, directly contradicted the Ciceronian ideals of his time, which emphasized benevolence and honor. But look deeper, and you'll find the true subtlety of Machiavelli's approach to enemies. He didn't merely advocate crushing opponents, rather he suggested using them strategically. In Discourses on Livy, he observes how Rome's internal conflicts between patricians and plebeians actually strengthened the republic. I maintain that those who condemn the disturbances between the nobles and the plebs seem to be criticizing the very things that were the primary cause of Rome's retention of freedom. This insight, that controlled conflict can strengthen rather than weaken, forms the cornerstone of using enemies advantageously. As Machiavelli wrote to Francesco Vittori in a famous letter dated December 10, 1513, I have learned to find profit in all my misfortunes. His personal tragedy became the catalyst for his immortal political writings. The psychology of strategic enmity. Modern psychological research confirms what Machiavelli intuited centuries ago: opposition often catalyzes growth. Studies on resilience demonstrate that individuals who face and overcome moderate adversity develop greater psychological strength than those who face either no challenges or overwhelming ones. This stress inoculation effect mirrors Machiavelli's understanding that properly managed opposition builds rather than diminishes power. The neuroscience is equally compelling. When we encounter opposition, our brains engage the anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors conflicts and contradictions. This activation, coupled with the prefrontal cortex's problem-solving functions, creates neural pathways that enhance cognitive flexibility. Simply put, having the right enemies literally makes you smarter by forcing adaptive thinking. Robert Greene, a modern interpreter of Machiavellian strategy, identifies this phenomenon in his work, The 33 Strategies of War, noting that the proper response to enemies is not to hope they disappear, or to naively pretend they don't exist, but rather to learn to manage and use them. This approach treats enemies as strategic assets rather than liabilities, precisely as Machiavelli advocated. Consider the psychological concept of the worthy rival developed by Simon Sinek. He observes that organizations with clearly defined competitors often outperform those without them, as the presence of an opponent provides motivation and clarity of purpose. Apple had Microsoft, Coca-Cola had Pepsi, Rome had Carthage. In each case, the existence of a powerful adversary drove innovation and excellence that might otherwise have languished. This strategic utilization of enemies operates at multiple psychological levels. 1. Identity formation. Enemies help define boundaries between us and them, strengthening group cohesion and purpose. 2. Motivational leverage. Opposition activates competitive instincts that can be channeled toward achievement. 3. Legitimacy enhancement. Overcoming visible adversaries convincingly demonstrates competence and strength. 4. Distraction utility. Well-chosen enemies can divert attention from internal weaknesses or controversial actions. 5. Scapegoating function. External threats provide convenient explanations for difficulties that might otherwise be attributed to leadership failures. A fascinating real-world demonstration of this principle occurred during the Cold War, when Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev declared to Western ambassadors, "We will bury you." In 1956, he inadvertently strengthened Western resolve and unity. The perceived threat galvanized NATO alliance cohesion in ways that might never have happened in the absence of a clear enemy. This dynamic, where the existence of an opponent strengthens rather than weakens, represents Machiavellian strategy at its most sophisticated. The Dark Mirror. Historical case studies. History abounds with examples of leaders who mastered the art of using enemies advantageously. Few exemplify this strategy more clearly than Franklin D. Roosevelt during the Great Depression. Facing devastating economic conditions and waning public confidence, Roosevelt deliberately positioned economic royalists as enemies of the common people. In his 1936 acceptance speech for the Democratic nomination, he declared, "They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred." This strategic enmity accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. It provided a compelling explanation for economic suffering, deflecting blame from government policies, solidified Roosevelt's image as a champion of ordinary Americans, and created a clear dividing line between his supporters and opponents. The result? A landslide electoral victory and continued popular support for his New Deal programs. Similarly, Queen Elizabeth I of England masterfully managed her relationship with Spain and its monarch Philip II. Rather than seeking accommodation at any cost, she allowed the rivalry to flourish in controlled ways that strengthened English national identity, justified military and naval expansion, and diverted attention from domestic religious tensions. The defeat of the Spanish Armada, in 1588, transformed what might have been a catastrophic threat into Elizabeth's greatest triumph, securing her position for the remainder of her reign. Even in business, this principle finds application. Steve Jobs, known for his Machiavellian tendencies, deliberately fostered rivalries with IBM and later Microsoft. These enemies gave Apple a clear identity in opposition to corporate computing giants, motivated internal innovation, and created passionate customer loyalty based on shared opposition to a common adversary. When Jobs declared IBM wants it all in the famous 1984 Macintosh commercial, he wasn't merely stating a competitive reality, He was strategically using an enemy to Apple's advantage. Machiavelli himself witnessed the consequences when Lorenzo de' Medici failed to properly manage enemies. After assuming control of Florence, Lorenzo attempted to consolidate power by dispensing with traditional alliance building. This created the conditions for the Pazzi conspiracy of April 26, 1478, a failed assassination attempt in Florence Cathedral that nonetheless killed Lorenzo's brother Giuliano and destabilized Medici rule. The incident demonstrated Machiavelli's later observation that enemies must either be completely neutralized or made useful. Half measures create greater dangers. The strategic inversion, making enemies work for you. How, then, does one transform enmity from liability to asset? Machiavelli's writings suggest a five-fold approach that modern leaders might adapt. 1. Strategic selection. Not all enemies are equally valuable. Choose opponents whose opposition enhances rather than diminishes your position. Machiavelli notes that a prince should prefer to be feared than loved, but crucially adds that he should avoid being hated. This distinction reveals the necessity of calibrating enmity carefully. 2. Controlled escalation. Manage conflict intensity to serve specific objectives. Too little opposition fails to motivate. Too much can destroy. In Machiavelli's Florence, families like the Albizzi and Medici maintained rivalries for generations at carefully managed intensities that prevented total warfare while preserving useful tension. 3. Triangulation. Use third parties to balance and leverage enemy relationships. Machiavelli consistently advocated playing potential threats against each other, as when he advised that a wise ruler should be a sincere friend and a sincere enemy, making his alignments clear enough to prevent adversaries from uniting against him. 4. Public narration. Control the story surrounding your enemies to maximize their utility. Machiavelli understood that perception often matters more than reality, writing that everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. By shaping the narrative of conflict, a leader determines how others interpret it. 5. Selective reconciliation. Know when to transform enemies into allies without surrendering advantage. Machiavelli observed that men must either be caressed or eliminated. This pragmatic approach recognizes that yesterday's enemy might become tomorrow's essential supporter. These principles find modern application in surprisingly diverse contexts. In corporate settings, CEOs like Andy Grove of Intel deliberately fostered what he called constructive paranoia about competitors to drive innovation. In international relations, countries maintain frenemies whose limited opposition serves valuable domestic and diplomatic purposes. Even in personal development, many individuals find that the right competitor, the runner who always finishes just ahead, the colleague who received last year's promotion, provides motivation that no internal drive could match. Consider how this might play out in your professional life. Rather than avoiding that critical colleague, what if you deliberately engage them early in the development of important projects? Their objections, painful though they might be, could identify weaknesses before they become fatal flaws. The competitor who keeps undercutting your prices might force innovations in efficiency you would otherwise never discover. Even the department that consistently competes for the same resources might, through that very competition, help you articulate your value more convincingly than you otherwise could. The ethical dilemma, darkness and light. Here we reach the uncomfortable core of Machiavellian strategy, its moral ambiguity. Using enemies advantageously often requires manipulation, deception, and calculated harm. Machiavelli himself acknowledged this tension, writing that a ruler should not deviate from what is good, if that is possible, but he should know how to do evil, if that is necessary. This willingness to transgress conventional morality, when expedient, earned Machiavelli his dark reputation. Yet there exists a spectrum of implementation that spans from the ruthlessly manipulative to the pragmatically wise. At its darkest, this approach treats other humans purely as instruments, creating, maintaining, and disposing of opponents based solely on their utility. History abounds with cautionary tales of leaders whose embrace of such methods led to their downfall, from Richard Nixon's paranoid creation of enemies lists to Joseph Stalin's perpetual purges that eventually weakened the Soviet system. At its most enlightened, however, Machiavelli's insight about enemies contains a profound wisdom. Opposition is inevitable in human affairs, and learning to channel it productively, rather than merely suffering or avoiding it, represents a higher form of strategy. As he writes in Discourses on Livy, good sometimes comes from evil and evil from good. A wise prince will justify punishments that are necessary. The ethical challenge lies in maintaining humanity, while implementing these strategies, recognizing that even as we use opposition advantageously, we engage with human beings whose dignity matters. Machiavelli himself, for all his ruthless pragmatism, remained committed to the ultimate flourishing of his beloved Florence. His methods served a vision of civic greatness, rather than mere personal aggrandizement. Modern leaders face this same dilemma. When Franklin Roosevelt welcomed the hatred of economic elites, he did so in service of policies intended to alleviate widespread suffering. When Elizabeth I maintained enmity with Spain, she sought to preserve English independence and religious freedom. The question is not whether to use opposition advantageously, that is simply wise leadership, but whether the ends this strategy serves are worthy of the moral compromises it often requires. The transformation, from victim to strategist, perhaps the most profound shift in Machiavellian thinking, involves moving from passive victim of opposition to active strategist. Most people experience enemies as unfortunate accidents to be endured or eliminated. Machiavelli suggests instead that they can be deliberately cultivated, maintained, and utilized as instruments of advancement. This transformation requires several psychological shifts. 1. From emotional reaction to strategic response. Rather than feeling merely hurt or angered by opposition, the Machiavellian strategist asks, how can this serve my objectives? 2. From avoidance to engagement. Instead of sidestepping conflict, the skilled practitioner selectively engages with it in ways that yield advantage. 3. From binary thinking to spectrum awareness, moving beyond the simplistic categories of friend and enemy, to recognize the utility of maintained tension. 4. From short-term thinking to long-term planning, understanding that today's painful opposition might yield tomorrow's greatest opportunity. 5. From passive suffering to active orchestration, deliberately creating conditions where certain types of opposition are likely to emerge. This transformation doesn't require becoming manipulative or unethical. Rather, it demands clear-eyed recognition of human nature and social dynamics, coupled with the courage to use these insights advantageously. As Machiavelli wrote, there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success, than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Shifting from victim to strategist represents precisely such a new order. Consider how differently you might approach workplace dynamics with this mindset. Rather than dreading the colleague who always criticizes your proposals, you might deliberately seek their input early, not to placate them, but to strengthen your position before wider presentation. Instead of avoiding the department that competes for resources, you might engage them in carefully structured collaborations that advance your priorities while giving them visible wins. The micromanaging boss becomes not just an annoyance, but an opportunity to demonstrate competence through detailed preparation they cannot fault. The Prince's Garden, cultivating useful opposition. If enemies can be assets rather than mere liabilities, the logical extension is learning to cultivate the right opponents. Machiavelli never explicitly advocates creating enemies from nothing. That would be both ethically problematic and strategically dubious. Instead, he suggests shaping existing opposition in ways that maximize its utility while minimizing its threat. This cultivation process might include 1. Selective engagement, choosing which opponents merit response, and which should be ignored based on their potential utility, rather than their inherent threat. 2. Controlled escalation, deliberately increasing tension with specific adversaries, when doing so serves larger objectives, while keeping conflict below destructive thresholds. 3. Strategic positioning, framing opposition in ways that cast you in the most advantageous light, as defender rather than aggressor, as innovative rather than traditional, as principled rather than expedient. 4. Alliance management, building supporting relationships that maximize the benefits of having certain enemies while minimizing their capacity to harm. 5. Narrative control, shaping the story surrounding opposition in ways that serve your objectives rather than those of your adversaries. Historical leaders who mastered this approach include Abraham Lincoln, who deliberately positioned himself between radical abolitionists and pro-slavery Democrats, using both as foils that enhanced his image as reasonable and moderate. Similarly, Charles de Gaulle cultivated a carefully calibrated opposition to the United States that strengthened French autonomy and identity without sacrificing essential alliance benefits. In Machiavelli's Florence,
The most successful leaders maintained carefully balanced opposition between noble families, guilds, and neighboring states. This balance, never allowing any single enemy to become too powerful, while ensuring none disappeared entirely, created a dynamic system where tension itself became a stabilizing force. Modern applications might seem less dramatic, but operate on the same principles. The technology executive who deliberately maintains a certain competitor as the industry leader to motivate internal innovation, the politician who carefully positions a specific opponent as representing values contrary to the electorate's interests, the negotiator who deliberately introduces a third party to create advantageous bargaining dynamics, all practice Machiavellian cultivation of useful opposition. The timeless wisdom, beyond Machiavelli, on June 21, 1527, having never regained his position in Florentine government, despite repeated attempts, Niccolò Machiavelli died at the age of 58. His political ambitions unfulfilled, he could not have known that his writings would influence leaders for centuries to come. The final irony of his life, that his greatest impact came through works written during his exile from power, embodies his own philosophy about finding advantage in adversity. The wisdom of using enemies advantageously extends far beyond Machiavelli's specific historical context. Eastern philosophical traditions contain parallel insights, as when Sun Tzu advises in The Art of War to know your enemy and know yourself. The Stoic philosophers of ancient Rome similarly advocated seeing opposition as opportunity, with Marcus Aurelius writing that, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Even religious traditions, often at odds with Machiavellian pragmatism, contain elements of this wisdom. The biblical injunction to love your enemies can be interpreted not merely as ethical guidance, but as strategic insight, recognizing that transforming opposition through unexpected response creates advantage that mere retaliation cannot achieve. The universality of this principle suggests it touches something fundamental about human nature and social dynamics. Opposition, properly understood and managed, serves functions that harmony alone cannot provide. 1. Clarity through contrast. Enemies help define what we stand for by embodying what we oppose. 2. Motivation through challenge. The presence of adversaries activates energy that comfort never could. 3. Innovation through necessity. Opposition forces creative solutions to problems we might otherwise ignore. 4. Cohesion through common threat. Shared enemies unite groups more powerfully than shared benefits. 5. Definition through boundaries. Knowing who we are not helps clarify who we are. These functions operate whether we consciously manage them or not. The Machiavellian insight lies in bringing this unconscious process into strategic awareness, deliberately shaping opposition to maximize its benefits, while minimizing its costs. The modern prince, practical applications. How might these principles apply in contemporary contexts? Consider these strategic applications. In business, solo identify competitors, whose existence actually helps define your brand's unique value proposition, then highlight these differences, rather than trying to eliminate them. Maintain certain regulatory challenges that create barriers to entry for potential new competitors. Selectively publicize customer complaints that allow you to demonstrate responsive problem-solving. Foster internal competing teams, whose opposition drives innovation and prevents complacency. Position your company against larger industry problems, rather than merely against other companies. In politics, cultivate opposition from groups whose values contrast most clearly with your constituents' priorities. Maintain relationships with critics, who help you identify weaknesses before they become liabilities. Create triangulation opportunities by positioning yourself between opposing factions. Foreign policy debates against abstracted opponents. Special interests. The establishment for policy debates against abstracted opponents. Special interests. The establishment who cannot effectively respond. In personal development, seek constructive critics, whose feedback identifies blind spots. You cannot see yourself. Engage with intellectual opponents, whose challenges strengthen rather than weaken your positions. Solonity seek in relationships with frenemies, whose success motivates your achievement. Use resistance as diagnostic feedback about which efforts merit. Persistence solonity sen, transform personal setbacks into narratives that demonstrate resilience and growth. In organizational leadership, solonity sen, create controlled internal competition that drives innovation without destroying cooperation. Maintain external threats that justify necessary but uncomfortable changes. Solonity sec, skeptics to test and strengthen new initiatives before full implementation. Position the organization against industry-wide problems rather than merely competing organizations. Leverage criticism as opportunities to publicly demonstrate organizational values. These applications share a common thread. They transform opposition from pure liability to strategic asset, not by eliminating it, but by channeling it productively. As Machiavelli understood, this approach requires both courage and calculation, the willingness to embrace conflict rather than merely avoid it, coupled with the wisdom to direct it toward constructive ends. The shadow and the light. As we conclude this exploration of Machiavelli's dark strategy, a paradox emerges. The approach that seems most cynical, using enemies for advantage rather than seeking universal harmony, may actually reflect deeper wisdom about human nature than more idealistic alternatives. By acknowledging the inevitability of opposition and finding value within it, Machiavellian strategy achieves a kind of pragmatic realism that pure idealism never could. Yet this approach carries inherent risks. The line between using opposition strategically and becoming defined by it remains perilously thin. Leaders who master enemy utilization may find themselves unable to function without adversaries, creating conflicts where none need exist. Richard Nixon's self-destruction through unnecessary enemies, Joseph Stalin's purges that eventually weakened the Soviet system, and countless corporate leaders whose competitive obsessions led to ethical compromises, all illustrate this danger. The wisest implementation of Machiavelli's insight involves holding opposing truths simultaneously. Opposition can be valuable, yet peace has its own virtues. Enemies can serve strategic functions, yet unnecessary conflicts waste precious resources. Calculated self-interest drives much human behavior, yet cooperation and genuine relationship remain essential to flourishing. Perhaps the final wisdom lies in Machiavelli's often overlooked humanism. Beneath his ruthless pragmatism lay genuine concern for his beloved Florence and its citizens. His methods, controversial though they remain, served a vision of civic greatness rather than mere personal advancement. As he wrote to Francesco Vittori, "I love my native city more than my own soul." This reminder that strategy serves purpose beyond itself offers essential guidance for modern practitioners. Using enemies advantageously represents not an end but a means, a method for achieving objectives that matter. When those objectives themselves serve worthy ends, Machiavellian strategy finds its highest expression, not as manipulation, but as wisdom about navigating an imperfect world. As you move through professional and personal challenges, consider how opposition might serve rather than merely hinder your most important goals. The colleague whose criticism refines your thinking, the competitor whose innovation spurs your creativity, the personal setback that reveals unexpected opportunities, all may be transformed from obstacles to advantages through the alchemy of strategic perspective. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing in exile as the sun set on Renaissance Florence, could hardly have imagined how his insights would resonate across centuries. Yet his fundamental recognition that reality must be engaged as it exists, rather than as we wish it to be, contains wisdom as relevant today as when he first penned it. In the strategic use of enemies, properly understood and ethically implemented, lies a paradoxical path to achievement that naive harmony-seeking can never provide. The most dangerous person in your life may indeed be the one who secretly contributes most to your success, if you possess the wisdom to transform opposition into opportunity, conflict into clarity, and enemies into unwitting allies in your most important endeavors.